Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. The United States has fought 3 conflicts in desert terrain in World War II, the Gulf War of 1991, and the Iraq War. With me today to discuss that is the college's resident military historian, author, and Iraq War veteran, Dr. Scott Garret. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
The first question, since World War II, what do you think is the greatest change in how desert war is fought?
Well, technological, the basic parameters of operating in the desert are the same as since in antiquity down through the present. Sources of drinking water, or our supply of drinking water, is always a big thing. But in terms of technological change, World War II was the first time that the United States Armed Forces engaged in large-scale desert operations. But between World War II and the first Gulf War and the current war in the Gulf region, technology has certainly come to the fore as the largest significant change. For example, air superiority is always a factor, and the helicopter has certainly improved not only communications but combat air superiority in both Gulf wars. So, a one-word answer is a profound difference in change is technology.
Well, let's go back to the first first desert experience, World War II, 42 and 43. The Americans, the British are in the desert fighting the Germans. How was the American Army trained prior to this operation?
The American troops that went into North Africa at the end of 1942 were trained in the Mojave Desert. A lot of those had extensive training in that area. Some of the replacements later didn't have the same extensive desert training. Their gear, however, was not specially adapted for desert warfare. They just had the basic uniforms, and so they put more on or took more off depending on what the temperature in the desert was at the time. By the time you get to the first Gulf War, we have specifically tailored desert uniforms and other equipment that is specifically designed for desert operations.
So in World War II in the desert, G.I. Joe was wearing the same basic fatigues that he would have worn in Europe, except maybe he would have taken a jacket on or
yeah, exactly. The Brits, the Italians, and the Germans had uniforms specifically designed for desert warfare, but the Americans in World War II did not.
Why didn't we?
Just a matter of logistics. Nobody really thought about it based on the desert training in the Mojave. The conclusion was that the standard issue uniforms were adequate, and as you mentioned, either put more on or take more off depending on the temperature.
Well, of course, the modern uniforms in desert warfare are sort of sand-colored. There was no attempt at blending in with the desert colors.
Well, the tan, especially early World War II uniforms, were brown to tan anyway, so that was considered close enough.
And of course, they painted tanks instead of the old olive green. They did paint them, didn't they, in desert colors?
Yes, they did.
For some camouflage.
The other countries camouflaged them. The Americans, most of the armored vehicles were simply the standard olive drab, but they did sometimes smear mud on them to help break that up. And plus, in the desert, the dust soon cakes everything and helps mute the colors.
Well, you mentioned things like modifying equipment. Obviously, in desert war, you're going to have problems with engines overheating. You're going to have problems with sand getting stuck in everything. Any special filters, anything done for that?
In World War II, they simply modified the filtering systems for the vehicles as best they could, but it was nothing by comparison to the sort of filtration system that they had by the time you get to the first Gulf War. So, and engine overheatings and filters simply clogging up and choking the engines were definitely a factor, more so in World War II than and for example, in the first Gulf War, the amazing thing is, by and large, all this stuff worked. It worked in the harsh desert environment, and it worked with minimal maintenance. So, for example, M1 tanks suck in a tremendous amount of air for the turbine engines, and the filters work fine. I mean, you have to change them pretty often or clean them often, but it was rare for a tank to cease, or any kind of armored vehicle to cease functioning because the filter was choked with sand or dust.
In World War II, of course, the Sherman tanks were gasoline powered, had to have been incredibly hot in the desert. How did they, if you're a tank crewman in the desert of North Africa in a Sherman, how do you deal with the heat?
You just are hot. I mean, that's not meant to be a flip answer. There was no cooling system. Some of the later Shermans had, it's called turret evacuators. It was a fan system to suck the fumes out of the turret, and the idea was to suck the fumes from the weapons firing so the crew didn't choke on them, and that helped some, but most tanks during that period didn't have that, so what it amounted to is you were just real hot. And heat casualties among the troops were a problem. They still are, but the number of heat casualties actually is quite small compared to earlier times, in part because of better training, but also for example, the M1 tanks and the Bradley fighting vehicles they don't have an air conditioning system in there, but they do have very strong fans to suck the fumes out, and so if you're in an environment where you can actually open the hatches, you get a pretty good airflow going through there. The standard rule of thumb in an armored vehicle is it's 10 degrees warmer inside than it is outside. In the desert, probably 20 degrees hotter.
Now, I'm assuming during World War II they took salt tablets too, believing
Yes.
that was. Does the Army still do that?
No, I don't remember when the changeover was, but it's been more than 20 or 25 years ago that the people that researched this thing determined that salt tablets really were no benefit. So the idea is just drink lots of water.
Right. Well, now, as far as the water ration in World War II, is it the same in modern times?
As well, it was the idea was drink as much water as you can, but obviously that's dependent on how good your supply is. I really don't recall what the daily calculated water ration for an American soldier in North Africa was in World War II. I know that when I first got into Iraq, we were getting 3 liters a day, and that's not really very much you can function on. That was drinking water. And I remember sometime in July, there was a red letter day, we were given 4.5 liters of drinking water a day. So that's pretty much, 3 liters is pretty much a minimum, because by the time you get into July in Iraq, the average temperature is around 130 degrees. That's just the temperature. Then if you're in a vehicle, it can be considerably warmer.
Right.
In North Africa in World War II, the temperatures were comparable. So at one point, the German Africa Corps in 42 was down to about a cup of water a day per man. Well, that's not even enough to actually survive on. They did the best they could for a few days, and their water ration was increased. But you start getting people that not only collapse, but that die from heat exhaustion.
Well, now, you mentioned 4.5 liters. How often would you drink that? I mean, do you space it out, or do you just chug one of these things?
Well, the suggested thing was drink whenever you feel like you needed to. Of course, if you drink a lot, then you may be several hours between your next drink. So most people, me included, tried to pace ourselves. So you may not be as totally hydrated as you'd like to be, but on the other hand, you didn't dry out as much as if you drank it all fairly quickly and then went several hours without a drink.
In World War II, of course, they had the standard GI canteen was an aluminum, a quart?
Quart.
So in the desert, how many of those would you carry on your belt?
2. They're plastic. The canteens are plastic now, but they're still the basic design. It still holds a quart. So most people carried 2 canteens on their equipment belt, but a lot of the times the water was issued in 1.5 liter bottles. Came up from Kuwait.
Today, but in the old days,
Oh,
for the difference, say in World War II, I'm sure you got the plastic
Right.
bottles.
Right.
But in World War II, you would carry 2 canteens even then?
They would carry as many as they could get. They were issued one initially, and then it was like somebody decided that maybe being able to carry more water would be a good idea, so then they were issued a second canteen. Some troops would scrounge up and they'd carry maybe 3 or 4. The problem is that just the bulk of the canteen, plus you have to carry your other gear and ammunition. The water distribution system in World War II was essentially either water tanker trucks, basically like a fuel tanker only carrying water, or the 5-gallon gas cans, but that you carried water in. Even if you what you wanted to carry the water in, if you're using a gas can type container, is make sure it was a brand new one.
Oh, yeah.
Because they tried steam cleaning ones that had hauled gasoline and put water in it, but you could never add there was always enough gasoline residue that even if it wasn't at toxic levels, it certainly made the water unpleasant. And Lister bags were a big thing, something that virtually doesn't exist anymore. The huge canvas bags that you put water in, that would be for a unit that was going to be in a place for a while. That was common in World War II.
And of course, they'd had to have carried enormous amounts of water for the vehicles too, for the radiators, wouldn't they?
Yes. Most American vehicles during this period, the smaller vehicles had water-cooled radiators. The tanks were air-cooled. The Sherman tanks were air-cooled. The German tanks had the advantage as they were all air-cooled diesel engines, so they didn't have to worry about radiator overheating. The tanks would sometimes overheat, but not the radiator problems.
Right. Well, now in World War II, the material, it was natural, cotton, wool, that sort of thing.
Yes.
Now they're modern fabrics, aren't there, for military uniforms?
Yes, but some of the desert uniforms are 100% cotton because it's still
the best.
Still the best. Well, they're working on a fiber that has started entering the supply system that is a combination of a type of synthetic and cotton, but it's the wicking type material that'll wick the perspiration off, and it's fairly tough material, but it also is lightweight and cool.
Wow, and of course that I know that you see that in hiking equipment, the
Yes.
wicking idea. In World War II, you just sweated
Right.
and
Wool-
dealt with it.
And dealt with it.
One thing that in World War II you noticed that even in desert conditions, people are wearing undershirts as well as a regular shirt. Is there a theory behind that?
Just a matter of insulation because you're going to sweat, and so it just helps the cooling process.
Of course, and you know, it's interesting too that as a society we're such sun worshipers. We're out in the sun wearing shorts and nothing else. In the desert, that's not really a good idea.
No, you need protection from the sun and also the sand and the rocks, and depending on where you are, you can be plagued with flies or mosquitoes. And so you always want to wear a hat, and if most of the time you wear your coat with the sleeves rolled down, and that protects you from the sun as well as insects. One of the things that was the British in World War II in North Africa went into combat wearing shorts. Well, that maybe was cooler, but it wasn't very pleasant because they certainly skinned up their knees and lower legs. You know, you have to take cover amongst the rocks and the thorns and the sand. The U.S. Army no longer has any issue khaki shorts or anything like that, so troops just wear, the regular uniforms. Sometimes in rear areas you take your uniform jacket off, but the T-shirt. And, as a matter of fact, I don't remember. Sunburn can definitely cause casualties. In World War II, about the only thing, or any of these periods, if you wore the uniform as prescribed, about the only thing that you would see that would be exposed would be your face, maybe the back of your neck and your hands. And sometimes there was sunburn cream issued, or anti-sunburn cream, and sometimes not, depending on what was going on. But if you're properly attired, sunburn is not really a problem. It's when you expose too much skin to the sun for very long that it really can. I mean, sunburn can kill if it's extreme enough. So.
And then, of course, the long-term effect is cancer.
Yes.
Other stuff. Well, as part of your desert equipment in Iraq, did they issue sunblock?
Sometimes it was available. I don't recall ever having any, but I never had sunburn either. I stayed covered up during the day.
Well, now, again, going back, when we're stateside, it's summertime, people run around in shorts, they run in a shirt or no shirt. These soldiers, young guys, I mean, how did you all, the senior NCOs, make them keep their shirts on and not strip like they do at home?
Most of the time that really wasn't a problem, because when you were in a rear area, you just advise. Most of the soldiers are not only are they all well trained. Most of them have enough self-discipline that they understand the consequences and will do what they're told because they understand the reason behind it. This is one of the advantages of an all-volunteer army. These people want to be there.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody was wildly overjoyed, but everybody is a volunteer, so
Mm-hmm.
they, as a group, more amenable to doing what is necessary. And plus, one of the things the American Army, especially, this is the difference overall between the American Army of World War II and the American Army of the last 30 years, is it's much more emphasis on everybody knowing what the mission is, as opposed to, well, you've got to do this because I told you so. So you still have to do it because the commander says, but there's a lot of emphasis on making sure everybody understands what the general mission, whether it's a combat mission or here's why you need to keep your coat on. This is not just, we're not ordering you to do this just to have something to do. There's a reason behind this. So there's a lot more emphasis on explaining the why and the wherefore of any of the requirements. And so most of the troops go along with it quite well.
Mm-hmm. In the Gulf War of 1991, were there any lessons applied from World War II to that? Was there any carryover from North Africa in 42 and 43 to the war, the Gulf War in 91?
Not directly, no. What happened was that by the time you reach the 1970s, the armed forces, not just the Army, but the armed forces have pretty much forgotten the lessons of World War II. You have institutional wisdom, and as soon as everybody that's in the system that had that experience retires, nobody pays any attention. But these were rediscovered, fortunately they were rediscovered before the first Gulf War, but the first major experience that the U.S. had in desert operations since World War II was in early 1991. The U.S. began conducting a series of exercises with the Egyptian Armed Forces called Bright Star, and the first Bright Star exercise was, I think, 1981. And I have the reports from that. One of the things they discovered is that sand and dust will cause weapons to malfunction. I mean, you read this, and it's like this has got to be an elaborate hoax, but this was written in the bureaucratic style of absolute seriousness, that they rediscovered all this stuff that they knew in World War II, had written manuals to reflect that, and then by the time you get to the 1980s, it's totally forgotten. But it was from and the Bright Star exercises are still going, have one annually. From that, they started relearning the lessons of desert warfare. So by the time you get down to the first Gulf War, there are always things to learn. Nothing ever works exactly as you anticipate, but they had already come to grips with the fact that sand and dust degrade performance of weapons and equipment, and had made countermeasures for that.
Of course, the equipment used in the first Gulf War and the Iraq War is far more sophisticated than in World War II. The fact that these are more sophisticated weapon systems, does that add for more problems in desert warfare? I know you said that the M1 tank worked well, but what about other things?
Most of this stuff actually works quite well. I mean, surprisingly so. I like, philosophically, all the technology is great, but does it work when you need it? Does it work in training? That's nice, but does it work in combat? And most of these things have actually performed quite well. In World War II, there was no such thing as precision-guided munitions in the sense we mean it today. Some stuff was more accurate than others, but by today's standards of accuracy, it was very inaccurate. In the first Gulf War, only about 9% of the munitions were guided of any sort. The Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, in excess of 80% of the munitions are precision guided. What that means is you need far fewer troops to accomplish the same mission. Instead of dropping 1,000 bombs hoping that 3 or 4 of them will actually hit exactly what you want, now it's one bomb to one target. Cruise missiles you can launch from 1,000 miles away and put through a meter square box at the other end. I mean, that's phenomenal now. And one bomb, one tank type thing. It's just so, I mean, it's not going to be totally push button. You still need people on the ground, but you don't need, for example, in World War II, you had massed armies fighting other massed armies, thousands or hundreds of thousands of troops maneuvering against each other in a fairly discrete geographic area. Well, you still need people on the ground, but you don't need millions of riflemen or hundreds of thousands. You need a few thousand here and there. And the technology is, bring me one war story that absolutely amazed. I've seen a lot of destroyed tanks, but I never saw one that was unrecognizable. But I saw one at a Special Republican. I eventually found enough of it to figure out it was a Special Republican Guard T-72 tank.
Soviet made.
Soviet made, that the Iraqis had bought from the Soviets. Most of their stuff was Soviet or Warsaw Pact. It was absolutely blown away. The engine was totally destroyed. It was just gears and fragments everywhere. There were just bits and pieces over a fairly large area. Talked to one forward air controller and found out that a JDAM, one of these guided 2,000-pound bombs, had been guided in on it and just absolutely blew it away. And so when you have that kind of precision on a tank, is a fairly small target, especially when you're attacking it from 20,000 feet or higher. And so the precision revolution is certainly carried over into military operations. And excuse me, and to follow up on most of these things work quite well, even in the desert environment. The desert, the heat and the dust degrade things quickly. I mean, computers, for example, wear out much more quickly in the desert. Everything else wears out much more quickly in the desert from the heat and the dust, and especially for the computer systems and all, they generate a lot of heat themselves, and so if you've got a computer system generating heat and the room temperature is 130 to 140 degrees, then it just doesn't last as long.
Well, I'm computer semi-literate at best, but I know computers don't like hot weather. So the Army was able to make sure these very sophisticated computers could function in this desert heat.
That's right, and what amazed me is in some fairly forward areas, you'd have rooms they had very small portable refrigeration units, and so they'd set up they'd find a secure area, or in some cases it was a tent, and they'd have all kinds of air conditioning support there to cool the confined space, to keep the computers cool enough so that they wouldn't malfunction.
And that was good duty being in there.
Oh, it was.
Yeah,
it was.
Yeah. In World War II, did the heat have any effect on the accuracy of weapons?
It always does, but not to an extent that it made much difference in the ballistic performance of the weapons. What the heat affected most is the heat waves. Since the weapon systems were ultimately, it was optical. I mean, line of sight. Somebody had to actually be looking through a rangefinder or looking over a sight to try to hit the target. The heat waves would distort the image, or would give. It's sometimes difficult because of the heat waves to determine the range fairly accurately. And this again is before laser rangefinders. You're looking out there trying to figure it out, either just because you're trained in estimating range, or you have coincidence rangefinders that are also optical, and so just the heat and the distortion from the extreme heat and the heat waves would cause problems with that. But otherwise, the ballistic performance of the ammunition was appreciably no different than today.
Going back to the old Sherman tank, it had, compared to a modern tank, I believe I'm right, a pretty narrow track to it. In the desert, did they discover you had to have a wider track to go crunching through that sand?
Yes, they had. But that was one lesson they'd actually learned from World War II. But it wasn't really. The wider track definitely works well in desert sand, but the wider track was originally developed across swampy ground, and so that was the U.S. and the Western military had probably forgotten the desert experience. But tanks designed late in World War II. The M26 Pershing that replaced the Sherman, and succeeding tanks had wider tracks for swampy terrain, and then they discovered that worked quite well in the desert too.
So. Before we went on the air, you were talking about in Iraq that the night vision was so crucial. And I know I've seen I'm sure you have too, films of there was a night attack the British made on El Alamein in World War II, and all you could see these cannons flashing. So there was some night action. But the visibility in World War II was very poor compared to modern. So we have these modern gizmos that you can put on at night and see, like Superman, can't you?
Yes, that's true. And in World War II, there were no night vision devices. There had some things that could kind of magnify the existing light a little bit, but they were not generally available or widespread in use. So when you fought at night, which most armies tried to avoid, I mean, you could not see. In fact, the flash of the guns made it even harder
Oh,
because your
really?
eyes could never adjust. You had the bright flashes, then it was dark, and so so most armies avoided night actions most of the time. Now there are exceptions, but by the time you get down to the first Gulf War, U.S. forces, their tanks and other vehicles and aircraft have night vision capability, or all-weather capability. It doesn't matter what the outside light conditions are, you can see the target because of different types of sights that have either thermal imaging or other varieties. And then by the time you get down to the current war, those are widespread. Individual troops have night vision devices that they can use for sighting. All the tanks, aircraft have sights that work in any kind of weather. And the Iraqis, they were, I guess, dimly aware that such things existed, but they were in such short supply in the Iraqi forces that they really weren't used to it. So what would happen in the first phase, the major combat operations from the 19th of, well, 20th of March, the land force kicked off, but the 20th of March through the 1st of May, the drive on Baghdad, they tried a lot of night attacks, and they would assemble maybe 1,500, 2,000 meters away from the American positions, the American vehicles, without being aware that they were easily visible to the gunners. And so they just, a lot of them were killed, clustered together, thinking they were safe. They were cloaked by the night, but they weren't. So eventually they caught on, but that took them a long time to appreciate that. And still, many Iraqis and the various insurgents have not yet come to terms with the reality of the night vision devices every soldier has one that needs one. They're common in the American forces. They were always rare in the Iraqi forces. And it was the same in the first Gulf War of '91.
And you think back in the expanse of the desert of North Africa at night, it had to be, as we say in Graves County, plumb dark. And it was just no illumination at all.
Right. What's amazing in the desert is that sometimes it is absolutely pitch black. There's not even any star shine. And so there, you really, if you get disoriented, you just wait till daylight, because you can. The disorientation can be complete. In World War II in Europe, one operation, I forget specifically which one it was, but it was a large-scale operation that some of General Patton of the Third Army's armored forces were going to be involved, and he refused. He said, "My tanks do not fight at night." They simply refused to play. And the reality is, it's bad enough as an individual outside looking around, and a tank at night without night vision capability, it's even worse.
We're out of time. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
My guest today was Dr. Scott Garret. I'm Barry Craig. We will see you next time.